Huckleberry Finn makes a case with no dogmatic preaching, just through the evolution of the relationship of these two boys going up and down the Mississippi. It's entertaining, it's insightful, and you end the novel understanding how Tom Sawyer has recognized the full humanity of his friend Jim. It's one of the most eloquent anti-racist novels.
Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to my Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 185. I am talking to Michael Grossberg, who is the co-founder of the Libertarian Futurist Society. He's also been involved with the Prometheus Science Fiction Awards. On the forum, I've always tried to encourage libertarian creatives, and Michael is definitely one of those people. The Libertarian Futurist Society has long been giving out awards to what they consider great novels, which have a libertarian message and are generally science fiction. How are you, Michael?
Thank you for inviting me to be on your program. I'm doing fine, eager to talk about the Libertarian Futurist Society and the Prometheus Awards, which the LFS was set up in 1981, 1982 to sustain and save after L. Neil Smith created it and presented it one year in 1979.
Yes. That's cool. Michael, if you don't mind me asking, how did you become a libertarian and get into all this?
Well, that's a long story, but from when I was a kid, I thought that aggression and violence and coercion was really barbaric, uncivilized, and wrong. And so I was in favor of freedom of speech and press, freedom of association, freedom of religion, freedom of belief, the right of dissent. And I was a little precocious. I started to read when I was 3, and I was reading some pretty serious books when I was 10, 11, 12, 13. And one of them, I was admiring people like George Orwell, not just the novels, Arthur Koestler, Aldous Huxley, and Gore Vidal. And I was reading some of Gore Vidal's essays. And in one of his essays, I don't remember what book it was, this was in the 1960s, he described his civil libertarian view and described it as supporting personal liberty, civil liberties, the Bill of Rights. And I thought, oh, that's what I am. So at the age of 12, I identified as a civil libertarian. And my family was Jewish, liberal Democrat, Kennedy liberals, not anti-capitalist, but supporting very much civil liberties and also some economic regulation, which I didn't know anything about. In the summer before 7th grade, all the smart, arty kids were passing around like Samizdat, a short novel that we were inspired by, which was Anthem by Ayn Rand. And we were just reading that in 7th and 8th grade and thought it was a wonderful poetic book about the importance of the self, of the sacred self. And most of us were liberals, and we had no idea about any of Rand's philosophy. And then I read The Fountainhead in 10th grade, and I was interested in the New Left and civil liberties. And I was reading people like Paul Goodman and Alan Watts, and eventually Ken Kesey. And then by complete accident, when I was in college, I saw an advertisement in a Bowker's book catalog for Libertarianism, a New Political Philosophy by John Hospers. And I ordered the book, and I thought, oh, I wonder if that has something to do with civil libertarianism. I had never thought of it as complete philosophy. Well, I read that book, and it just connected up everything to me because I've been reading Rand, and suddenly I realized that the reason why we call things classical liberal arts education is because it emerged from the classical liberal, emerging liberal order of modernity from the Renaissance, and civil liberties were tied to economic freedom and private property. If you have government socialism and they own all the means of production, there's no independent place to stand because the printing presses are owned by the government and you have no way to express an alternative view. And for the first time, I made the connections and I understood that civil libertarianism, if I really cared about that the most, which I still do, the First Amendment, then you have to support economic freedom and private property. You can't have one without the other. And from that perspective, coming from a liberal background, I immediately made two connections that most people still don't understand. Ayn Rand was never a conservative. She was not an arch conservative. Her political philosophy was always a modern restatement of classical liberalism, which in the 1800s and early 1900s was 90% libertarian before leftists and progressives took over liberalism and stole it and redefined it as, well, we still want to benefit from all this stuff, but we just want to use the power of government for good, which is a very dangerous thing because Lord Acton, the great British classical liberal 19th century historian who is considered one of the most brilliant people of his era, he's famously misquoted, but in a letter to a friend of his overseas visiting America, he wrote, he didn't write power corrupts. That's a misquote. He was a Catholic who believed in free will. He was a liberal, which is 90% libertarian, who believed in freedom. He said power tends to corrupt, which respects free will and liberty and choice, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that, by the way, is the theme of The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien, which was inducted into the Prometheus Hall of Fame for best classic fiction, because that insight about the dangers of coercive power, not economic power, which is the power to seduce, but political power, which is the power to rape and kill and enslave, yes, is dangerous per se and cannot be used beyond its limited scope to keep the peace. So I realized, number one, that that this is the true fulfillment of real liberalism. And there are some libertarian economists in the last 10 years trying to get the term liberal back because people use it, especially right-wing or conservatives, they use it to indiscriminately confused with progressives. But one of the biggest underreported trends in the past 2 or 3 decades within the Democratic Party and within the left is the extermination and exclusion of real liberals from the left because they hate liberals. Progressivism has some positive aspects and many authoritarian aspects, and it's been trying to get rid of the liberals from the left. Well, if they're getting rid of it because they're corrupting the term, let's grab it back because libertarians are truly liberal. Libertas, from the Latin, yes, liberty. And who has a more liberal attitude about things in general? Individualists and libertarians, live and let live. Yeah. So that's a little longish answer to your question, but that's the perspective I've always had, and I believe it's the correct perspective. And that doesn't imply anything about, who you vote for because everything's corrupt on all sides, but it does imply that there's a system of modernity which emerged with the Renaissance and rule of law and limitations of government and opening of free markets and innocent until proven guilty, all of which is under attack from all across the spectrum since this awful bizarro world, 21st century, went astray starting on that Tuesday morning in 2001, September. And I just feel like I'm in some alternate reality Superman comics where everything is a dystopian nightmare sometimes. Yes. It's a highly illiberal era now. That's a very long answer to your question, but what do you think about that? That's got to be one of the more unusual evolutions into a libertarianism that you've ever heard.
Well, not that unusual hearing people who started with Ayn Rand, although it's not that common when I hear, although I usually hear the Fountainhead or Atlas Shrugged. I don't always hear Anthem. Occasionally, I actually started with the essays. But it's very interesting to see what's happening right now. I use that phrase too much. And certainly, I definitely think we should reclaim the word liberal. I hate the term classical liberal because that implies that you're old, you're antiquated, you're a has-been. You're not going to win people over by calling if you tell people, if you say you're a has-been. I've been using the term lately called I've said rock star liberalism. I won't go into detail why I call it rock star liberalism.
Hayek wrote a famous essay, I think it was in the 60s, called Why I'm Not a Conservative, and he looked at the available words, and he's argued for being a Whig. But if you look at the actual Whigs, the Whig Party, WHIG, in the early 1800s, they were very inconsistent. And I think the Cato Institute back in the 1990s, early 2000s with David Boaz were trying to argue for we're market liberals. I think that's just as good as classical liberal, or you could say limited government liberal.
Yeah.
There's no perfect word. And the main thing is you need to try to get people to think outside of tribal categories, because every concept has multiple levels of nuance in it. So it's not so important, the label, as the meaning and an understanding of it.
Yeah, I'm fine with those words. I mean, almost anything would be better than the word classical. It's just, because that's. But anyway, so you got involved. You've been involved with theater critics. Who are some of the best, best free market or libertarian novels out there right now in your view? Or
well, one of our
we've lost a lot of our great novelists recently. So
yes, now some of the leaders in the Libertarian Futurist Society were encouraged by Travis Corcoran, who was the first novelist in history who won back-to-back Prometheus Awards for Best Novel for The Powers of the Earth and its sequel, Causes of Separation, part of his Aristillus series, which is a whole different way of imagining the same plot as Robert Heinlein's The Moon is Harsh Mistress, which is one of the first two works inducted into the first Prometheus Hall of Fame for Best Classic Fiction, and it's one of the best libertarian science fiction novels there is. Corcoran is working on some more novels, and he's a new generation person. But I just want to mention Tom Jackson is a journalist like me, and also writes and leads the Robert Anton Wilson blog. Robert Anton Wilson and Bob Shea co-wrote the Illuminatus trilogy, a satirical trilogy that was also inducted in the early years into the Prometheus Hall of Fame. But Tom, who's a Best Novel judge, recently nominated for this next category, this next cycle that's just starting out, Mania, the new novel by Lionel Shriver, who has had two previous novels nominated for the Prometheus Award. Both times they became Best Novel finalists. One was The Mandibles, which looks forward to it imagines the next 30 years, focus on a family in the United States during inflationary debt collapse and what happens to the breakdown of civilization. And then more recently, Should We Stay or Should We Go, which is an alternative history novel that imagines multiple scenarios for how things could go wrong with the collapse of the welfare warfare state in the United Kingdom. Both were finalists. We don't know what's going to happen this year, but Mania looks like a good prospect to be a finalist again. It's just the first thing nominated. We usually have 10, 15. This past year, we had a near record 17 novels nominated on our short list from which we choose finalists. But Tom said in his blog, he considered Lionel Shriver to be the greatest living libertarian novelist. And I had not thought of that before, but I think maybe she is. She's a very maverick thinker who also writes a column for the Spectator magazine worldwide. And I think she might have been focused on with some articles about her works at some point over the years in Reason magazine, but I think she's not as recognized by libertarians as Robert Heinlein or Ayn Rand were. Most of her novels are not science fiction, fantasy, or alternative history. Mania is an alternative history novel, which I haven't read yet, but the reviews are raves, where she imagines something that's a variation of Kurt Vonnegut's Harrison Bergeron, where radical egalitarianism completely undermines all individual merit, where everything has to be coercively equalized, like a Procrustes bed, which is a very rich libertarian theme. Vonnegut's short story was inducted a couple of years ago into the Prometheus Hall of Fame. And I think there's a lot of great novelists out there. But Lionel Shriver is someone who's, I think, a pretty amazing writer and thinker these days. That's one example of somebody that I think more libertarians should be aware of.
And that's Shriver.
Yes, Lionel Shriver. She has an American and a Brit going back and forth. Most of her novels are mainstream. I can't remember the exact title, but she's most famous for a novel, something about, we've got to talk about Kevin, that became a film with Tilda Swinton.
Kevin, yes. Yeah.
That's what she's most famous for. It's amazing to me. There are other writers, and here's an interesting point about the Prometheus Awards. It's not an award for libertarian writers. It's an award for works that explore, dramatize, and champion libertarian and anti-authoritarian themes that illuminate something about the evils of tyranny, slavery, war, and other things that are created by the engine, of course, of government, or illuminate the virtues and benefits of freedom. So a lot of the writers who've won Prometheus Awards were not libertarians themselves. And there was one very popular writer named Ira Levin, who's most famous for Rosemary's Baby, and who wrote The Stepford Wives. He wrote several other novels, A Kiss Before Dying, that was a 1955 film with Joanne Woodward and Robert Wagner, who I happened to interview in the late 1990s. And all of his novels have been made into films, except his greatest, most libertarian novel, which is one of the great dystopian novels of the past century. And that is This Perfect Day, which there is a review essay on the Libertarian website, which is www.lfs.org, explaining what's great about this novel and why it won the Prometheus Award. But basically, it sort of reflects a lot of the ideas of the late, great libertarian psychiatrist Thomas Szasz in exploring the rise of the therapeutic state and how a therapeutic soft glove tyranny could be more insidious in controlling people and manipulating them than something that's a more hard-edged evil tyranny, such as 1984, where Orwell imagined a boot stamping on the human face forever.
Yes. I think it's important that we have novels that explore libertarian themes that aren't necessarily written by libertarians.
I agree. And what's interesting about science fiction and fantasy, or more broadly speculative fiction, is it's often the literature of ideas. It explores ideas. What happened if this one idea became dominant in this society? Or what happens if this one invention changes how people relate to each other, and then explores the implications of that. So a lot of science fiction fantasy writers explore all sorts of themes that interest them, including crank ideas like Dianetics, and general semantics in the 1940s. Science fiction writers explored every kind of thing, good or bad. But a lot of the major writers who are not libertarian identified at all, have written libertarian classics, like Cory Doctorow, who's getting increasingly more democratic socialist in the last 10 or 20 years, and seems to be, in his nonfiction, more and more skeptical of a libertarian society. Nevertheless, he's won the Prometheus Award 3 times. The first time was for his greatest novel, Little Brother, inspired by the big brother of Orwell's 1984, and it's a coming-of-age, young adult story set in the near future about the national security state in the United States and how young people who are into tech discover a conspiracy and then are persecuted. And it's just a wonderful novel. A sequel to it called Homeland also won the Prometheus Award. Cory Doctorow is definitely not a libertarian, but the novel itself is one of my favorite novels within science fiction and fantasy, and is one of the best novels to win the Prometheus Award. So there are a lot of people worth reading. Probably people who are writing now and publishing stuff that we're not even aware of, who are doing stuff that we would like.
Yeah, this is one of the things that that's kind of somewhat regretful about the lack of our libertarian book catalogs. I mean, I realize that I'm probably the last, or one of the youngest libertarians out there who got most of his libertarian education from book catalogs, and those libertarian book catalogs would have the fiction in there. But now if you're a libertarian looking for a place to shop for libertarian themed novels, where do you go?
You know, there are multiple uh, challenges in that area. But when you mentioned the book catalogs, I learned a lot from those book catalogs too. I exposed me to whole literature. And, you know, Andrea Millen Rich and her husband, Howie Rich,
Yes.
they ran the Laissez-faire Books catalog for many years, buying it from a guy who actually, I can't remember his name. He and Sharon Presley, who's
Eric
still around.
Harris?
I can't remember the guy. He had a little bookstore in Greenwich Village, but they bought it from him and they made it a national book catalog.
Yeah.
And they hired Roy Childs, who's one of the brilliant young libertarian theorists. He had a collection of his essays published in Liberty versus Power. And I knew Roy. He was so brilliant, one of the leading libertarian theorists of the 70s and 80s before he died very young. But they didn't just list, for people who don't know about these laissez-faire books catalogs, there were like mini essays and sometimes full page insightful essays, often by Roy, sometimes by other people, explaining what is new and interesting and insightful. It was actually one of some of the best reviews you could find in the catalog, highlighting many different things, including fiction. Every time there was a Prometheus Award, they highlighted the Prometheus Award winner along with the classics. And they helped, I think, us become better known because they highlighted, you know, the 1985 Prometheus Award winner, that early generation of libertarian science fiction writers, some of whom won several different awards. Victor Coleman, who's still around, won the Prometheus Award 3 times. We've invited him to come and be one of the presenters of this year's Prometheus Award ceremony on Zoom in mid-August to present the best novel category. J. Neil Schulman, Brad Lineweaver, and L. Neil Smith all did a lot of explicitly libertarian novels, some of which became best novel finalists and some of which won. That generation is mostly past now, but there are new generations of people writing. And also, you can't reinvent the wheel. James Hogan passed. I had a chance to have a beer with him at a WorldCon. Great guy from Britain who came to be an expatriate in the United States. And he wrote quite a lot of great novels. Yeah. But Voyage from Yesteryear was one of the first ones that won the best novel. And that's one of the most explicit libertarian science fiction novels ever written. I highly recommend Voyage from Yesteryear.
Voyage from Yesteryear by James P. Hogan.
I should mention something else for people who may not be familiar with the Libertarian Futurist Society. Besides just our website, lfs.org, we've added a video category showing different videos of award ceremonies and speeches by authors and panel discussions. And we have a Prometheus page that lists every single past winner of the Prometheus Award in the 3 categories that we have, which is now more than 100 different works. That includes Best Novel, Prometheus Award for Best Classic Fiction, and also occasional special awards. And unlike Best Novel, the other 2 categories could be any type of works. It could be a novel, novelette, a story, an anthology, a trilogy, a TV series, a TV episode, a film, a song, a record album. Currently this year in our Prometheus Hall of Fame category, one of the great libertarians lyric songs by Rush, The Trees, is a finalist for the Hall of Fame. We did have Patrick McGowan's innovative TV series, The Prisoner, that was inducted into the Hall of Fame early in this century. And he was still alive and was very appreciative of it. And that was a series that was very imaginative, with fantastical elements, but really had a theme of individualism and resistance to oppression. And there's a lot of stuff in popular culture, in Western civilization in general, and in American culture in particular, that's very individualistic.
L. Neil Smith and J. Neil Schulman are no longer with us. Lineweaver still alive?
He unfortunately died a few years ago. We have obituaries about all of these people. That's the other thing I should mention. I should mention 2 things. We used to have a quarterly Prometheus newsletter that did a lot of reviews of nominees and potential things. And we have the back issues of that under our newsletter page on the website, where you can have PDF links to read all the back issues. But starting, I think, around 2019, we shifted from that, as so many organizations have, to a blog, the Prometheus blog. And it's accessible as a subhead, the blog under lfs.org. And we have posted articles, reviews, essays, um, like every 3 or 4 days, we're posting something, and all of it's free. People can go to lfs.org, go to the blog page, and then just type in your email address to subscribe, separate from the membership subhead where you can actually join the Libertarian Futurist Society and become a Prometheus voter at the full level, which is only $60 a year. But one of the things that we have recently completed doing on the Prometheus page, next to every title that's won, on the right it says appreciation. That's a link that goes directly to a review essay posted in the last 3 years on the blog, where we try to do something that's very, very important. It's an appreciation of each past winner, but not just an appreciation. It's a review and it's an essay, but it also answers a question that a lot of people have who are not familiar with libertarianism or not sure what the Prometheus Award is about. It explains how the novel fits the distinctive dual focus of the Prometheus Awards, which is at once literary and about liberty. And that, I think, has been so educational and helpful. Some of the essays I wrote, some our LFS President William H. Stoddard wrote. Many of our other leaders have written or co-written appreciations. Chris Hibbert, a past board president, has done so. And I think a lot of that, those reviews are really wonderful guides to reading, explaining not just with the list, but a track record, which I think has become pretty impressive. For example, Quillette magazine, a leading maverick or liberal publication, did an article a few years ago called The Libertarian History of Science Fiction by Jordan Alexander Hill. And it has several paragraphs talking about the Prometheus Awards. And the most interesting thing about it is how it puts the libertarian science fiction into the broader context of modern science fiction and how influential it is. But he says, he talks about each year the Prometheus and Prometheus Hall of Fame Awards are given out by the LFS. Unlike most ideologies that advocate forms of protectionism and Luddite restrictionism, I'm quoting from the article, the libertarian outlook values choice, freedom, a general openness to radical new ideas, and an instinctive rejection of stale convention and custom. Perhaps this is why so much of SF expresses itself as dystopian fiction, a genre which, by its very nature, cannot but take on a libertarian flavor. Totalitarianism, war, and wide-scale oppression is almost always carried out by state force. Liberation, accordingly, must come in the form of so-called negative rights, that is, freedom from, and voluntarism. So we've gotten a lot of attention over the years in several publications for the Prometheus Awards, which are now 45 years old and have survived longer than a lot of SF fantasy awards. Of course, all sorts of awards are proliferated in this field and in entertainment. But a lot of people now view the Prometheus Award as third in importance after the Hugo Awards, voted on by the World Science Fiction Convention fans, and the Nebula Awards, both voted on by the Science Fiction Writers of America.
That's really great to know. Yeah, I've heard of both of those awards. So if I wanted to, what advice would you give to anybody who wants to become the libertarian novelist?
Well, I think somebody, you have to practice by doing, and I've written thousands of articles and reviews and features, but I'm a journalist, not a fiction writer. I know a lot of people these days have more opportunities for self-publishing, and you could publish on Amazon, and you can bypass the middleman. And every now and then, 1 in 100 of those people become mass bestsellers and get picked up by bigger publishers. People have to want to write, and most people who become writers, they're going to be writing as kids, writing stories, and it's hard to make a living at that. So we have to respect people who do that. A lot of people, like people I cover as a theater critic, actors or musicians, so many people want to do that there's so much competition that most people can't make a living at it. So they have to have a day job. And then they face the struggle of how do I have the day job, come home from that, or get up early in the morning before I go to my day job and spend an hour or two writing something. That takes enormous discipline and drive. But in science fiction and fantasy worlds, a lot of people break into that by first writing short stories. And there are various workshops and advice and blogs to help guide people. One is the Mad Genius blog, which is written by several writers who've won the Prometheus Award and others. Sarah Hoyt, one of my favorite Prometheus winners, her first novel to win the Prometheus Award was called Dark Ship Thieves, which inspired a whole series of novels that imagines a future anarchist, anarcho-capitalist society on an asteroid fighting an authoritarian Earth in the future settled solar system. And last year's winner, Dave Freer, who wrote Cloud Castles, a satirical coming-of-age SF novel that's set in a cloud colony floating above a gas giant on a distant star. Great sense of humor. Dave Freer is the first writer from the Southern Hemisphere to win the Prometheus Award. We've had people from England. We've had a Finnish writer, Johanna Sinisalo. I've got her book cover, The Core of the Sun. She won for that feminist dystopian anti-authoritarian novel some years ago. But there's just a lot of great people writing stuff. And one of the things that's fun for those of us who are active in the LFS is you get to discover authors you wouldn't have known about otherwise. But Dave Freer was a great discovery. He'd been writing a lot of novels, some of which had strong anti-statist in them, but I didn't know about him until one of our LFS members nominated Cloud Castles. Steve Galima, one of our board members and veteran members from Colorado, an engineer who worked on one of the Mars probes, nominated that novel that went on to win. And there's just such a rich literature. And you can find out about this whole rich literature, which is broader and more diverse than you ever imagined, from checking things out on the Prometheus blog and on the lfs.org website.
Do you think if you are a libertarian novelist, should you, and you're marketing your novel, should you try to just market to the mainstream, or is there because there can be a danger of getting the label of a libertarian novel, and then you end up the only people who buy your novel is libertarians, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of writing a libertarian novel.
Well,
right?
I think labels are superficial and they're limiting and they're for lazy people. And I think if you're anyone in any area, you don't want to be pigeonholed. You don't want to be stereotyped, because we're all individual. Recognizing the vast, broad variety and diversity of individuals is part of the foundation of individualism and libertarianism. So the best strategy, I think, is not to label yourself at all and to just focus on writing a good story, which in some cases you may want to write a love story and has nothing to do with the political dimension at all. And you might have a great success that way. It is true that people form opinions of you. Some of the articles I've read on the Mad Genius blog that Sarah Hoyt and Dave Freer write about, where it's writers offering tips to other science fiction fantasy writers. It's interesting that you develop a certain audience, and then audiences always think they want the same thing they got before. But if you give them the same thing you had before, they have a deflation. They're a little bit let down. So they want something fresh, but they also want something familiar. But everybody naturally, unavoidably develops a reputation. So you have to label the genre very clearly. If it's a romantic mystery with SF elements, it's very important with the book cover and the title and the book blurb that it be clearly identified so that people who like that sort of thing won't feel, oh, I thought this was this, but it's that. Because some people are just, they want to read one kind of thing. Some people only want to read fantasy and not science fiction. Some people want to read mysteries and they don't mind a locked room SF mystery. But people have to figure out how to market themselves by appealing to different audiences, but they want to build audiences. And that's something that increasingly these days with self-publishing, more and more authors have to spend time doing that, which is a real problem because they'd rather just spend all their time writing or as much time as they can devote to writing. But now they have to market themselves in this new world of self-publishing, which has pros and cons. There's not as much of a gate preventing a new writer from breaking into getting published, but there's so many people self-publishing that it's like thousands of books every year. It's a blur.
Yes, true. But one thing, though, I know you get, you'll get a 70% royalty on Amazon, and you will definitely not get that from a traditional publisher. Not to mention, I've heard stories of authors getting access to some of their old novels because their publisher wanted to stop publishing them.
That's right.
But then the authors get the rights back, and they say, well, they won't publish it because, well, I'll go put it out on Kindle, and then they end up making more money off those because the one thing that
Sarah Hoyt has done this.
Yeah,
she got her back catalog back with her Dark Ship Thieves series, which I think is 4 or 5 novels, including A Few Good Men, and she not only reissued them herself with ebooks, but also republished them as paperbacks, and she did well with it. Yeah. But then if you do that from the beginning, who knows about you? She had started off with several major publishers, and she also has written in many categories of historical fiction, fantasy, science fiction. I think a lot of writers write. That, if you want to be a writer, you got to write. The more you write, the more you can learn, the more you can improve.
True. Yeah. I mean, well, I think one thing that out there is, I remember reading one place years ago that a traditionally published novel had to sell 8,000 copies to break even. I mean, now you can, to break even a Kindle maybe needs 500. It depends on how much you spend. Every once in a while, some writer will say, I need 10. I've seen this happen where they have like a GoFundMe or something, like, I need $10,000 to publish my book. And it's like, no, you don't. Why are you asking for this kind of money? But anyway, yeah, marketing certainly helps. Are you familiar with Hugh Howey by chance?
No, who is that?
He wrote a series called, there was a novel called Wool, and then there was the series is called Silo. It's one of the more successful independent publishing success stories out there.
Well, send me a link on that so I can look it up.
I don't know if it's libertarian or not, but that's one thing.
Well, one little secret, all the people who are science fiction fantasy fans, who also care about freedom, who are members of the Libertarian Futurist Society, we love reading great science fiction and fantasy. A lot of the stuff we read, we have favorite writers and favorite novels that don't have anything to do with the Prometheus Award and which are not appropriate to nominate for it. But we love many great stuff. Lois McMaster Bujold has a whole Vorsikian saga, and I've met her. She used to come to Marcon every year before she moved north from here. And she did eventually win a Prometheus Hall of Fame for Best Classic Fiction for her novel Falling Free, which happened to explore libertarian themes. But I love reading her for many other areas. Oh, I should mention Terry Pratchett, who died a couple of years ago, one of the great British satirical science fiction writers. His whole Discworld series is hilarious. But he's also been nominated for and won the Prometheus Hall of Fame for Night Watch, because even though it's funny, he was very knowledgeable about history, the evolution of markets, the evolution of civilization, and he, in a humorous way, shows the politics, the obstruction, the corruption, and also the innovation that led to the modern free market liberal order. He has great insight and is sympathetic to the progress that's possible through freedom. And he does it all in a way that doesn't preach at all, but is just hilarious and absorbing, with a detective investigating issues in Ankh-Morpork, the capital city of Discworld. Few people ever think of him in a libertarian context. And even though only 1 or 2 of his novels have won or been finalists, I Like the Truth, because it's about the emergence of a free press. And I'm a journalist, newspaper journalist. So I love that novel. Hope it gets nominated and eventually inducted into the Prometheus Hall of Fame at some point over the years. But most people don't realize that his entire series is informed by what could be called, hate to use the term, Chris, a classical liberal, free market oriented view, respecting the actual history of how so much progress has been made in the last several centuries due to increasing freedom and innovation and unleashing people through the cooperation of free markets. So there's a lot of great mainstream novelists and works that have powerful themes that affirm civilization in a way that's very congenial to libertarian and classical liberal analysis. David Boaz, I think the vice president of the Cato Institute, has really been writing about this theme in recent years. In this illiberal era, one of the biggest strategic and philosophical goals for the libertarian movement, David says, and I completely agree with him, is for us to save true liberalism, defend the liberal order from all of the illiberal authoritarian elements of the left, the right, the progressives, the populists, the nationalists, not all of whom are completely wrong. People have legitimate concerns, but a lot of their solutions just make things worse because they increase centralization of political power, which inevitably gets abused and hurts minorities, the general people, and the individual, who I think Ayn Rand said was the most persecuted minority in America.
Yes.
Maybe it was businessmen, but I think it's the individual.
Yeah, we had to talk about, the difference between what you call libertarianism versus individualism. And for example, I noticed you've given the award to Atlas Shrugged and you've given it to Anthem, but I don't see We the Living or The Fountainhead on there.
Well, I love We the Living, which I said that was her first novel, and it's a historical romantic tragedy with three central characters set in the early years of the Soviet Union. And I view it as a romantic tragedy on the same level as Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is very high praise. And if Ayn Rand were alive and it's seen that comparison, I think she'd be very pleased because she actually introduced me to Victor Hugo, who I'm a huge fan of. And she was a big fan of Hugo and of Dostoevsky. The Fountainhead is a great work of individualism, and it has some implications for libertarianism, but it's clearly not a speculative novel of science fiction or fantasy. And just between you and me, and I guess the world, I wish there was an award that would fill the vacuum, the gap that I perceived since the 1970s in recognizing any works of fiction that endorsed individualism, including libertarianism. But although we had some early nominees and finalists in the 1980s that were broadly, loosely included, like Kay Nolte Smith's novels, The Watcher, Elegy for a Soprano, eventually the organization had to face the fact that there's too much out there for us to read, and most of our members are fans of science fiction and fantasy. Even then, it's a huge challenge every year to find the needles in a haystack, especially by authors we're not familiar with. You can always check authors who you previously have read. Do they have something new, and does the book description imply it might fit our award, and then you can read it. But it is so hard with the thousands of speculative novels for alternate history, dystopia, horror, fantasy, mythological, fantasy, fable, science fiction, just to cover that field. The Prometheus Award had to narrow down more clearly with its boundaries on science fiction, fantasy, speculative fiction that also explores, illuminates, champions the value and benefits and virtues of liberty, or exposes the evils of tyranny, totalitarianism, and other forms of false coercive authority. Yeah. So just culturally, based on who the people are, we had to narrow down to a niche that we could actually cover. And I wish it was broader than that. Bill Evers, a libertarian leader, he's focusing mostly in the area of education, but on his Facebook, page, he regularly shares classic works that affirm civilization in some way. Some of it's just some of the greatest works in civilization, and he doesn't just highlight novels, but also statues and art, which are compatible. And I really love someone who has that broader focus. But so much to read, so little time. I wish our lifespans were twice as long, and you had so much more time to just soak up this great culture. There's so much fantastic stuff, not just from Europe and the United States, but there's great stuff from India and China. Oh. Just to mention to you, I read my first Salman Rushdie novel this past year.
Yeah.
I read Victory City, which was nominated for this past year's Best Novel Award, and I did a review of it for the blog, which I encourage people to find and read. He is clearly affirming that the advances of civilization are highly correlated with free trade, equal rights, rights for women, sexual equality, peace, whereas the times when civilization gets bad for the average person is when it becomes authoritarian and tyrannical. And he's writing from a clearly classical liberal viewpoint, which is very compatible with libertarianism in this particular mythological fable, which is fictionalized from medieval India. Well, now I want to read some of his other stuff.
Yeah.
Because also when you look at what happened to him in his real life, he's a real example of a brave, courageous man and dissident who keeps speaking out. I think he's a major literary figure.
Yeah.
I don't think he's ever been exposed to libertarianism, but Victory City is a wonderful novel. I wish it had become a finalist. Didn't quite get enough support to become a finalist this year among our typical slate of 5 finalists. But how wonderful to discover someone steeped in another culture in Asia who is not just affirming values we recognize, but universal values. I think the roots of civilization and individualism and libertarianism, it's not just some temporary modern ideology. To the extent it's valid, it reflects universal truths about human nature.
I've people ask me if I could have one superpower, I think it would be super speed reader. I mean, imagine being able to read Atlas Shrugged in 4 hours, or I got a comment about Rushdie. When Rushdie got stabbed, I immediately went to Amazon and bought 2 of his books. I just, I said, this is my. I mean,
Good
it's
for
not
you.
much, but I could go out and say, and I haven't read, and like a lot of people, you go and buy those books, haven't read them at all. But I said, okay, this is my way of saying.
Well, I can tell you they're probably worth reading.
This is my way to say I stand with Salman Rushdie, just for that.
People wonder, what can you do?
Yeah.
What you can do is you can buy a book and read it. And if you like the author, you can buy another of their books, and that helps them. You can go to see a movie or a play that you like, whether it fits your current focus on a particular ideology or not, and then you can talk about it and share it with other people. You can mention it on your blog, on your Facebook page.
Yeah.
And that's the incremental things that every single person has the ability to do just about. It's not like you think in some utopian way, well, I want to save the world from disease. Well, nobody can do that, but you can be a doctor and then have particular clients who you help and save their lives. It's one step at a time. It's putting on your pants one leg at a time.
Yeah.
And people get delusional when they get into politics or philosophy. They start thinking pie in the sky, and then they fall into the trap of utopianism. But libertarianism, properly understood, is 100% anti-utopian. There are legitimate ideals that are grounded in reality, that can be achieved in reality. And then there are ideals that are false ideals and even evil ideals, like what Ayn Rand referred to as collectivism, or radical coercive egalitarianism, or communism, or socialism, or fascism, which was the socialist Mussolini's brand of Italian socialism. And, people need to think beyond labels and need to open their minds through reading. And one of the other things I am frustrated with in this current era is that so many of the younger generation are not only not even learning how to read in these horrible government schools, where because of the teachers' colleges, they've opposed teaching them through phonetics which is the actual best way to teach people to read. They use a look-say method, which is imperfect.
Okay.
Finally, some of the leaders there have come to realize, oh, it's particularly harming the poor and uneducated and black, so therefore we finally should face it. Well, I'm glad they're recognizing it now. But even people who learn to read, there's less reading now. People are getting what they think is accurate information from Facebook or from what used to be Twitter or from one particular news feed from their particular favorite publication or media, whether it's the New York Times or MSNBC or Fox News, and they think that that little piece of what they're getting is the world. But it reminds me of one of the great things I learned from ancient Indian philosophy and religion, that ancient fable about the 7 wise men who are all blind, who are each touching a different part of the elephant. That's a great story to look up. And one guy touches the nose of the elephant and says, "Oh, it's like a curved pipe." And somebody else touches the flank of oh, it's a wall. And someone touches the leg. Oh, it's a column. Somebody touches the tail and says, it's a snake. And of course, the metaphor is, those 7 blind men are us, and the elephant is the world. And each of us has a small piece of us that we're overgeneralizing and extrapolating from. It's not that what we're experiencing is wrong, but there's more to give us a better understanding. And we need to commit to have what I guess Hayek would call epistemic humility, that we don't know everything, even if we know a lot. Since the 1990s, a lot of the cognitive psychologists have confirmed that there's like 15 different kinds of bias that is rooted in our genetic evolutionary history. And I don't remember what all of them are, but the one that applies to me that I remembered, it's a confirmation bias. When you're especially brilliant, especially educated, those people have even more confidence in themselves, and it can verge on arrogance. It can verge on the illusion that because we know so much, that we should be confident about things we don't know as much about. And we get biased and we don't see more. But I think having a humility gives you an openness to learning more that we should all pursue, and realize even if there's a great edifice of libertarian thought that's been developed in the past century from Hayek and Ludwig von Mises and John Hospers and Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden and Thomas Sowell and so many other great thinkers like Thomas Sowell, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but I've read many of his books. Even if you have a substantial understanding, you can always build on it. And there's always more that you don't know. And one of the reasons I love reading science fiction and fantasy is it opens you up to new ideas. It gives you an aha moment beyond your assumptions. It allows you to do what Ayn Rand used to say was to check your premises. And so I think there's something visionary about a literature. I think all great fiction does this. If it's a great masterpiece novel, you can vicariously see how other people lived, and you don't have to make those mistakes yourself. Ever since the Gutenberg Press, we've had this wonderful opportunity to experience hundreds of other vicarious lives through novels and stories, so we don't have to make those same mistakes. Instead, we make totally horrible new mistakes. But that's better than repeating the same old mistakes, because we're all fallible. We all make mistakes. So I just think reading is so important. And one of the reasons why we're having a lot of problems in civilization now is because a lot less people are reading. To me, the 21st century is like the fulfillment of the Old Testament parable of the Tower of Babel, not because of war or plague or flood or earthquake, but because of the success and increasing transformative wealth and education. People now have greater choice over their lives, and there's so much more to learn that we can't, any one of us, know more than a fraction of 1/1,000,000% of the total knowledge out there. So we have to rely on each other. Yes. For cooperation, which is the actual essence of the free market. Why do people say that the essence of the free market is competition? It's obviously cooperation. And you can't cooperate when you're under the gun of the state. In order to have real voluntarism, you have to have consent. And so I just think it's great when people open up their minds to think and to read. And that's why I've dedicated 45 years of my life in part to the Prometheus Awards.
What novels do you think were a bad influence against freedom? Are there any ones that come to mind?
Well, I wonder whether they're more an effect than a cause. But, you know, if you look at the utopian fiction, in college, I decided on my own to read every single book of utopian literature, going back, starting with Plato's The Republic. And I respect Plato because he lived 2,400 years ago, but that's a bad blueprint for an elite becoming dictators of the rest of us. Not a good thing. I read Francis Bacon's The New Atlantis. One of the more recent ones that was a bestseller in the 1890s was Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards.
Oh, yeah.
But did that cause people to embrace, there ought to be a law. We think this is bad. Let's expand government power to stamp out those people over there that we don't like. I think it was more popular because people already had those ideas and attitudes and embraced them. But interestingly, in terms of world culture, Eugene Zamyatin, a Russian writer, wrote the first dystopian novel, We, which was inducted in the first 20 years of the Prometheus Hall of Fame. Its plot is somewhat similar to Anthem. Some people have argued or speculated, well, was she aware of that before she wrote Anthem? Anthem is very different in tone, but it is about the discovery of the self, affirming the self in a totalitarian system. And then you have Aldous Huxley, brilliant guy, with Brave New World, which has not been nominated, certainly not won a Prometheus Award, but it doesn't quite fit the Prometheus Award, and yet I think it's a very good novel because he was the first one to say, and he talked to his friend George Orwell when he was writing 1984 and after it came out, and he said, you know, Eric Blair, you've got a great novel here, but I think that far more likely in the future will not be the kind of extreme totalitarian thing that people recoil from in cruelty, but the soft kind of tyranny through soma, through drug control, and through pacification of culture that he wrote about in Brave New World, and which Ray Bradbury, who I was fortunate to be able to interview twice and spend a day with when I had him as a main speaker around 1985 at the Future of Freedom Conference. Such a gentleman, such a great humanist, and clearly he called himself a Jeffersonian liberal, which back in the 50s, before the left smeared Jefferson because he had a 50% genetic possibility of having fathered a child with Sally, the slave, used to think positively about. So we can't use that term anymore. And Jefferson does have a mixed heritage. I don't know why he didn't free all the slaves. That is a problem. But classical liberalism, Ray Bradbury really embraced. And in Fahrenheit 451, he's not just talking about censorship and the state, but he's talking about this passivity in culture where they're all watching TV and are not reading because it's been stamped out by the government. You could argue from a libertarian perspective, cause and effect there. If you have a government suppressing and throwing down the Orwellian memory hole, all history and all books, a consequence of that is likely to be that people are going to be like children and not have thought because they need to have freedom to have real debates, not be canceled by authoritarian, fascist, young generation of mob psychology like the French Reign of Terror in the 1790s. And they need to be able to read and think. I wish our schools and universities would teach thinking and would teach fallacies of thinking. I had a great professor at the University of Texas when I was in the Plan 2 honors program in the 70s. And the first book he recommended was Karl Popper's Conjectures and Refutations. And Karl Popper turns out to have been associated with Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, and wrote a book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, that maybe went a little too far in describing Plato's The Republic as the first fascist utopian dictatorship template, but still had a lot of great insights about what is required for there to be an open society. And it's just amazing to me how you can find shards of our great heritage all around of the classical liberal arts education. Almost no college teaches the classical liberal arts well-rounded education anymore. They've eliminated civics. They don't teach introduction to Western civilization. That's a real mistake. It's a form of slow suicide of our culture. I don't have any objections to including the great literature from China and India, and giving people a broader perspective, but we need to learn our own direct heritage too.
And these aren't science fiction novels, but what do you think about Uncle Tom's Cabin in Don Quixote?
Well, Don Quixote by Miguel Cervantes is considered maybe the first great world-class novel. When I think it came out in the late 1500s. And of course, there's the Man of La Mancha musical with, the Dream, the Impossible Dream, that was very popular in the 60s and has had a few revivals on Broadway. I want to talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin. That's a great question because, I miss J. Neil Schulman, and I had conversations with Neil, and he wrote essays about this, and so have I. When Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, it was a huge bestseller, bigger than the biggest bestseller in our era in terms of the percentage of the country who read it. And there's a famous story, I don't think it's apocryphal, that Abraham Lincoln met with her after it was a best-selling book, arguing for the evils of slavery and why she was an abolitionist, probably a Christian abolitionist. There was a lot of religious foundation to the abolitionist movement. But look, the abolitionist movement was the last major successful libertarian movement in American history. The first one was the American Revolution itself. And what they called liberalism at the time is closer to modern libertarianism than to anything else. It's certainly far closer than what most people think of as modern liberalism. And she did write in a melodramatic 1800s style, and later generations got very offended by the Uncle Tom stereotypes. And I don't disagree with any of that. But in the context of its time, this was a powerful novel that had a major impact on bringing an end to slavery. And Abraham Lincoln made some quick comment like, "Oh, so you're the little lady who whose book has allowed us to reach this point where we can abolish slavery." I forget what his even better quote was. J. Neil Schulman said that he thought that Uncle Tom's Cabin is one of the greatest novels in American history, even though it's rarely read today. One of my friends, a college roommate, Jeff Hummel, who's a leading economist, historian, professor, has been connected with Stanford Institute. He's just retiring from Golden Gate University.
Yeah, and he also wrote Emancipating Slaves.
It's a revisionist book on the Civil War, Emancipating Slaves, Enslaving Free Men, A Narrative History of the Civil War. It's a great book that is encyclopedic and actually has about a half dozen to a dozen fresh insights in it, which when Jeff was writing it, I read the manuscript, he said he recognized it's very hard and rare when it's such well-trod territory, but he had a couple of insights. And his book is anti-slavery and anti-statist, which is a unique libertarian combination. Well, he recognized that Uncle Tom's Cabin is one of the biggest best-selling books in American history, especially as a percent of the population who read it. And it had a really positive impact. And Jeff Hummel told me that he read it, and it was actually an enjoyable book. Obviously, there's some dated stereotypes in it, but, I'm a theater critic, and I reviewed the last major revival of Porgy and Bess on Broadway, which Sondheim, the great Sondheim, who died at 91, 2 or 3 years ago, he, in his book on his 2 books on lyrics, Finishing the Hat, praised to high heaven as the greatest work of musical theater of the 20th century, Porgy and Bess, which George and Ira Gershwin worked with Haywood Dubose and his wife, adapting their 1928, 1929 Porgy and Bess play into a great opera that's also a musical. And it's entered the regular pantheon of all the operas, and it's also been revived on Broadway about 8 times. And Audra McDonald, who I interviewed in the 1990s and has won more Tony Awards than any other actor, she played Bess, and it was a magnificent production. But reading the history of Porgy and Bess, a lot of the brilliant writers in the Harlem Renaissance, like Zora Neale Hurston and that guy whose name I can't remember, who wrote The Wild Party, they had very mixed feelings about it because Porgy and Bess focuses on the gullahs, the poor, ignorant people on the coastal communities of South Carolina, and they had mixed feelings about it because they recognized it's a great work and it focused on African Americans, which at the time were called Negroes. But the solution to that is to have more stories with more diverse viewpoints of different kinds of people, so that it transcends, so that anyone who was ignorant enough at the time when the musical came out around on Broadway, like I think it was 1936, they may have thought, oh, that's the way all Black people are. But that's just a prejudice. I'm Jewish, I'm gay, I'm a libertarian, I'm a triple minority, and each of those things has been stigmatized and misunderstood and distorted. I can't tell you in college how many, when I was talking to people about my ideas, how many people say, oh, you're just a left winger, or you're just a right winger. And I said, have you ever heard of anyone else in the so-called left wing or right wing who favors this view? Have you ever heard any right wingers who want to legalize all drugs, decriminalize prohibition, and repeal victims' crime laws? No. The good judo aikido trick is to ask a question that causes people to have cognitive dissonance, to suddenly pause, like, that doesn't fit my template. Because if you get suddenly shocked, that doesn't fit my preconceptions, you might help them trigger an aha moment where there's a little bit of daylight between their identification with whatever they believe and have all their identity invested in, and seeing a little bit of daylight of a wider truth. And Porgy and Bess overcame its stereotypes and came to be recognized as a great opera and a great musical. And I think in the same way, Uncle Tom's Cabin, while it's not on the same high level of artistry at all, I think Porgy and Bess is really brilliant in many ways. But some of the characters in both, you could be a little uncomfortable with. But you know what? Art should make you uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Art should challenge you. Art should never be a safe space. Art and culture and ideas in the realm of discussion should open you to different ways of thinking. And people need to be trained to think for themselves and to develop a resilience to be comfortable with words. Because the paranoid, bizarro world inversion of some young people on the progressive socialist left, who now seem to believe that words are violence, but violence is just expression, well, that is fascism. That is undeniable fascism. And some of these people think of themselves as anti-fascists, but they are fascists. And in fact, socialism always ends up as fascism, as Susan Sontag, who I had a great conversation with in the late 1990s before she died, sitting next to her at the Humana Festival of New American Plays thing. She had a famous speech that was brave because she's from the left. And in New York, she gave this famous speech, I forget if it was 1989, 1990s, where she was basically saying socialism is fascism. And it was controversial. And then the left just rejected it, went down the Orwellian memory hole. You combine the fact that socialism in practice always ends up as a totalitarian Orwellian 1984 fascist state or communist state with Jonah Goldberg's, he's a free market libertarian leaning conservative. His book, Liberal Fascism, which he since has had a couple more nuances about, it quotes the title, which a lot of reviewers didn't understand at the time. H.G. Wells was a utopian socialist, and I enjoyed reading his The Time Machine and War of the Worlds and Invisible Man when I was growing up. But he was a utopian socialist, and when he coined the term liberal fascism, he mentioned admiringly that the next step from liberalism to this collectivist ideal future would be a positive thing. People threw down the memory hole at the end of World War II when they discovered the millions of people, including two of my relatives at Auschwitz, who died in the concentration camps. And then the left said, oh, no, that's not socialism. That's not what we meant. This is right wing. But all the time it was rising from World War I through the 20s and 30s, were indiscriminately approving all forms of collectivism. And they were saying that whether it's socialism, communism, fascism, this is the wave of the future. And if you have to break a few eggs, by which they meant kill a few people, then that was necessary for the march of inevitable history. And that is evil. That is evil, and we should call it evil, but we can't just call something evil. We have to explain why it's wrong, why it's mistaken, why it violates the basic respect for human dignity and moral autonomy, which is at the foundation of individualism, libertarianism, and classical liberalism.
I think there are libertarian themes in Mark Twain.
I love Mark Twain. And I thought about nominating him, but there's only one novel that fits science fiction fantasy, which I enjoyed reading as a boy, Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. And it has themes of individualism in it. But he is a real American individualist, and he was also a great skeptic of church and state. Smart guy, too, because in his will, he had plans for the next century and more to have some things released 30 years, some things 50 years later, which ironically he didn't need because he's still such a great writer. But Letters from the Earth came out in the 1960s, and I read the paperback. And a lot of different stories that he very much critiques of false authorities. And he was very much an individualist. I think Huckleberry Finn is one of the great American novels. And it's not just a coming of age story about a friendship between Tom Sawyer and his friend Jim, who's a slave, but their ride up and down the Mississippi and all the picaresque adventures they have, written from the point of view of that era. So it has the N-word in it, which makes some people uncomfortable, but I don't think they should expurgate novels. I think they should have an introduction to explain that he was writing to people of the era. That is a story that is implicitly libertarian in the sense that it supports the theme of why slavery is an abomination and should be abolished, because you see the natural thing from Tom Sawyer's point of view, how other people treat his friend. And he grew up in this culture where he never thought outside the bubble. Gradually, he starts to think, oh, I like my friend. He's like me. These people are mistreating him because of the color of his skin and because he's a slave. And Tom starts to doubt that and starts to have a broader experience from his travels with his friend. This doesn't feel right to me. This feels wrong. And the brilliance of this novel, this is why it's one of the great American novels, along with Herman Melville's Moby Dick, that I enjoyed reading, along with his Taipei, and Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, and F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. And The Scarlet Letter has some aspects about individualism and freedom in it too, with false accusations and stuff like the Salem witch trials. But Huckleberry Finn makes a case with no dogmatic preaching, just through the evolution of the relationship of these two boys going up and down the Mississippi. It's entertaining, it's insightful, and you end the novel understanding how Tom Sawyer has recognized the full humanity of his friend Jim. It's one of the most eloquent anti-racist novels in history, and it's strange that that guy, Ibrahim Kendi, what's his name, who's in favor of this ridiculous, narrow-minded, crank version of anti-racism that can't imagine that there's all sorts of reasons why people are different, not just the color of their skin, and how they end up in different ways because of different time invested in different things and different opportunities and different intelligence and different degrees of working hard. Ironically, he probably condemns that novel as racist, but he's a racist, in fact. And Huckleberry Finn is arguably the seminal anti-racist novel in American history. I mean, I also like The Color Purple. I thought that was very powerful as a novel, as a film, Spielberg's film, and then the musical, which I've seen and reviewed twice on Broadway, the original version, and then the second version with the revival that was even better. There's other great works that highlight, in a way very congenial for normal human beings who care about people, who are libertarians and individualists. But the first was Huckleberry Finn.
Yeah.
And because it doesn't have anything to do with science fiction or fantasy, it's not appropriate to ever nominate it for the Prometheus Award.
Yeah, there's some novels out there. I also just thought of, kill all the blue jays you want, but tell them it's a sin to kill a mockingbird.
That's another great novel, which just had a run on Broadway with the revisionist view that gave more agency and voice to some of the supporting characters who are Black, and it illuminated it for a new generation. The play's very good, and the novel's very good. People fall into ruts. They think, I'm sure that somebody unconsciously just assumes, without even thinking about it, that all those people who are libertarian science fiction fantasy fans only read that and don't read all the other stuff. But we love reading that because we also read the other stuff, and some of it may not fit our particular focus in that award, but we're human beings like everybody else. And when there's something as a wonderful novel and has a great story or a great play or great movie, we can be touched by it. It's sort of like Walt Whitman, who I think is a great humanist, not specifically a libertarian, but his Leaves of Grass, where he's talking about how he just identifies with all human beings. I think you become, if you're lucky and you can grow up and have a life, you can mature. And part of a live and let live philosophy is recognizing that there's all different kinds of people in the world, and each of them has a right to live and to make their own choices, as long as they respect your equal liberty to make your own choices. And if we could just refrain from aggression, violence against other people, if we could prohibit the initiation of force and fraud in Ayn Rand's formulation as the basic legal and moral foundation of a civic and moral and legal code in society, then I think that would restrain the dangerous power of government, and we would have even more culture and progress and diversity than people can even imagine today.
Yeah. Do you think Charles Dickens is at least partially responsible for the spread of socialism? I mean, it seems like every story he has, it's portraying about how horrible this is, and there are all these problems in the world. And
well, I've enjoyed reading Charles Dickens as well, and there are many different novels of his. I forget which one it was. I can't remember whether it was Little Dorrit. There's one of his novels that talks about the baleful influence of a political legal lawsuit that blights the lives over generations of everyone involved in the lawsuit, that just keeps wending its way through the slow courts. That's something talking about the corruption of law and bureaucracy that would be congenial to libertarian perspective. I just can't remember which novel it was. But I want to tell you, I read an article somewhere in some national magazine. I don't remember the title of the story. First, I'm going to say, as a theater critic reviewing for 40, 50 years, the most often done work year by year in Columbus, Ohio, and in most other cities are the different versions of A Christmas Carol. And A Christmas Carol has the stereotype of Scrooge. This is why the stereotypes in Porgy and Bess and in Uncle Tom's Cabin and in terms of anything else that becomes so popular that it then develops a stereotype in the first place because of its popularity, should be looked at objectively. But you still love A Christmas Carol because it's a story of redemption. But on the superficial level, Scrooge is just a greedy capitalist businessman. So you have that anti-capitalist stereotype. But actually, you could interpret first, of course, a Christmas Carol in several different ways and said, oh, he's a human being after all, who can be opened up to being a more human person. And you can have a work ethic and want to support sustaining your society and your company through the profit motive, which is the only way to sustain it, and then still decide to be generous with your family and coworkers, as many businessmen are. But what I wanted to tell you was I read an essay, I wish I could remember it, saying that people are familiar with Dickens' A Christmas Carol, but they're not familiar with another story he wrote some years later that takes a completely different and pro-freedom, pro-capitalist version of the holidays. I wish I could remember the name of it. I can't even remember what magazine I read it in. I read across the spectrum of the leading opinion magazines, liberal, conservative, libertarian, and I find there is insights across the spectrum, along with various prejudices or blind spots across the spectrum. And it might have been in a conservative magazine like National Review or the American Spectator, where I read that. I wish I had written it down. I made a note to myself, oh, I should try to look that up and read it. I only read that article, but I was fascinated and delighted to find out, Charles Dickens was just a great storyteller. And the great storyteller of our era in that tradition is John Irving. I have one of his latest books right on the shelf next to me, which is on my to-read list.
Is that The World According to Garth?
He did The World According to Garth. Just a second here. I just bought The Last Chairlift to read because I'm a fan of his, and he is one of the writers who, in his particular take, is that he loves these really rich stories of humanity that are big books with all sorts of the different portraits of people in them. And he really focuses on narrative and storytelling, like Robert Heinlein did. Robert Heinlein was the great storyteller in science fiction. And storytelling should not be underestimated. I think, we just had the passing of one of the great libertarian science fiction writers. We should mention Werner Vinge.
Oh, yeah.
He won 4 Hugo Awards. He also won a Hugo Award. He won 3 Prometheus Awards, one for Best Novel for A Deepness in the Sky, which is one of the best sophisticated new space opera novels. He won that in 2000. He just died a couple of months ago, like April. And we had a tribute to him on the Prometheus blog. His story, True Names, was the first fictional story imagining the modern cybernetic era. And it's widely recognized as sort of a visionary work. He also, the third thing he won a Prometheus Award for, but also in the area of the Hall of Fame for Best Classic Fiction, is a story called The Ungoverned, that it shows a free society that's lawful but without government. He was such a nice man. I invited him to come out to be one of the guests of honor at MarCon in Columbus, where we had our first LFS con.
That was in 2001.
And he was one of the speakers there. I'm so glad he came out. A real gentleman like Ray Bradbury. There are other people, by the way, who've won the Prometheus Award, like Colin Ellison, who's more of a radical rebel liberal, but he won for a short story, and certainly wasn't a libertarian. But it's just great to have the range of recognizing people when they happen to write a particular story that has that great individualist, anti-authoritarian, supporting the maverick right to think for yourself and make your own choices kind of theme, which is, we are fortunate in this world to understand, is not just a libertarian thing, but also an American thing.
Yeah. I believe, was that the highest attended MarCon ever?
I think it might have been. A lot of science fiction conventions, fantasy conventions are fading or collapsing because the older generation can't do them anymore, and they're now privatized for-profit versions like Dragon Con that are much larger. But they move away from books and focus on media and big stars. But the big reason that's happened is because when I was growing up, the only place you could go get science fiction and fantasy, and you were thought of as weird, you were thought of as a minority. There was a term from an A.E. Van Vogt novel called slans. We were like a special fandom. Yeah. You had to go to a convention to find that fellowship where people didn't view you as weird. But look what's happened to popular culture with movies and television. There's science fiction and fantasy everywhere, done with amazing special effects. Young people growing up in that, instinctively, why do I have to go to this convention to get what I already have everywhere here? Where 8 out of 10 of the top movies every year throughout this century are pretty much science fiction or fantasy or animated features with fantastical elements. They're getting it in the mainstream culture. So why do they have to go to a convention for it?
True.
That's a problem. And, I don't want to see science fiction fandom end, but I could say it's parallel to something else. The success of a movement changes things.
Yeah.
I remember marching for not just anti-draft, anti-war stuff in the 70s when I had long hair, but I also was standing up for gay rights back when I thought I was bisexual and not gay. And in Austin, Texas, after you go to university there, you can sort of drop out and stay in Austin. It's like Lotus Land. It's like Peter Pan, Neverland. It's hard to get out of there to actually start your life. But I was supporting gay rights. But when we didn't have full mainstream gay rights, gay and lesbian rights, there were these independent gay bars, which I didn't go to because I don't like bars, but they also had independent gay bookstores, which I did go to.
Yeah.
And all of those collapsed for two main reasons. One, gay life became mainstream and all those books became available through mainstream stores. You didn't have to go there to get them. And with the rise of computers and the internet and Amazon, you have social media where you can connect rather than having to go to a bar. So the gay bars mostly closed. We used to have, I don't know how many, a dozen in Columbus. And now there's one I know, Club Diversity, that has theater events. So I go there sometimes. And then, of course, the big cost savings with Amazon made some of the book chains go under. And there are independent bookstores, but they have to do a lot to really appeal to a local group and become a social center and have book readings to survive. It's much harder. Most of the gay bookstores that were famous in San Francisco and New York are gone. I used to visit them when I went to San Francisco and New York. But is that a problem or is that a consequence of progress? A lot of progress is very disruptive. What Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. I wish he wouldn't have called it that because idiots who don't understand it think, oh, capitalism destroys things. No, actually, like bankruptcy, it liberates things for resources to be better used for other people. I wish he just called it creative change. Change is really hard for all of us. And I tell you, as I'm getting older, I'm 71 now. I was very open-minded and very liberal in a cultural way my whole life. I'm having a harder time dealing with changes now than 10 or 20 years ago. Even if I recognize a lot of the changes are positive in my personal life or in the world, I miss some of the other things. I miss being able to have a fellowship where you had a gay space. And so that's happening there. That's an example. It's exactly the same thing happening in science fiction land.
Certainly. Is Victorian Village still the gay neighborhood, or is gay like, or is there no longer a need for a gay neighborhood, so to speak?
That there's no longer a need for a gay neighborhood. I know there's people in every neighborhood.
Yeah.
My husband, we got married last year after 18 years. He has a condo in Westerville. That's not viewed as a gay city at all.
Yeah, definitely not. It's a suburb. Yeah. It's also dry still, right?
I know. I'm in a social club for senior gay couples, prime timers, and we have a potluck every month on a Sunday afternoon, and people host it in different places. Well, we've gone to every single part of the city. Yeah. There's people in German Village, there's people in Hilliard, there's people in Worthington, there's people everywhere. And that is a mainstreaming. Mainstreaming is good, right? But then you get assimilated, and then you don't have your special institutions that used to support you when you were oppressed. So it's a trade-off.
Yeah.
Economists, free market economists say, everything in life is a trade-off. Progress means new challenges.
Yes. So one thing too is people tell me that all the gay people moved into Victorian Village, and it was a horror. It didn't look nice at all. And then when they bought all these houses, they made it look nice, and it turned it.
Well, there are a lot of young straight couples who are also gentrifying too and making it look nice.
That was good too. Yeah. One thing I've got to comment about on Marcon though, we had the peak in 2001. That was Memorial Day weekend, and less than 4 months later, we had a very significant event after that. And I remember, these people didn't want to bring their costumes on the planes and stuff like that. I think the World Trade Center was a huge factor in the drop in Marcon attendance.
Probably.
Yeah.
The ripple effects of that first major terrorist attack on the American mainland, which was equivalent in many ways to Pearl Harbor, roughly the same number of people, about 2,800, 3,500 died. And then the American reaction to that, an overreaction to that, an underreaction to that. Everybody thought we were going to have more terrorist attacks, and they did a lot of things that prevented a lot of attacks. But then you got the TSA, that's an incompetent bureaucracy that doesn't actually stop any of the tests they do to smuggle things on. And the worst thing there, we are all evolved from mammalian primate hominids. And evolutionary biology shows us, confirms science now, that we all had a common ancestor, all the great apes, including humans, about 6 million years ago. But we didn't descend from the apes. That's a naive falsehood. But our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, has been around for maybe 300,000 years. But most of our genetics, is wired into us from previous species, overwhelmingly. And I think they've now confirmed like 9 or 10 other human species, not just the Neanderthals, but also the Denisovians. And they all have died out, except for us. We're the last surviving human species. So we shouldn't blow it. We should try not to blow it. But we also have to recognize our background. We have various instincts. And if I could just indulge in stereotypes, I'm talking about all of us. We're not monkeys, but we're mammalian primates, which means wired into hierarchy. This is why libertarians are not people who are opposed to authority. We're opposed to coercive, illegitimate authority, and the alternative to coercive, illegitimate authority is real authority, voluntary earned authority, like a leadership, not tyranny. But if you look at monkey behavior, they whoop it up and scream as loud as possible when there's a danger, and that's a successful strategy for them. And they get more attention. Now you look at human society in any part of the world, in America, regardless of race or religion. Oh, it's a terrorist attack. Well, you people here who we don't like, you're terrorists too. Well, you're terrorists. Let's take up that battle cry of terrorism and apply it to all these other things. Or let's take up all sorts of other things that become, oh, you're an insurrectionist. There was an insurrection there, not just a mostly peaceful riot at the Capitol on January 6th. Let's call them insurrectionists, even though it doesn't fit with any of the definition of insurrections throughout history. They didn't even enter with any guns. But everybody now takes what the attention of the elite is and say, we want attention too. And we're going to shout loud and say, this is the same evil. And suddenly, whatever you don't like, these local criminals we don't like, they're terrorists too, or they're insurrectionists too, or they're racist too. It's a primate thing that we got to see past to see, is this metaphor gone too far? Can people have problems and be considered failures or bad in some respects, rather without all being labeled terrorists?
Yeah.
That's a tendency that we all have. I'm not saying the other people over there who aren't libertarians have this tendency. I'm saying everyone, including those people who we see when we look in the mirror, we all have that tendency. It's wired into us. And that's why Ayn Rand and Steven Pinker's advocate of rationality, which is a practice, almost like a meditation, and helps with reading and thinking, is so important to try to balance and counteract that natural tribalism, which is at the root of so much bad things, such as anti-Semitism, homophobia, racism, attitudes that throughout history have led to slavery when the Romans enslaved the Greeks, who looked just like them, but they were another country, another tribe. Nationalism has been the major area where people have identified in a tribe and then demonized the outsider. I remember when I was growing up reading that the word barbarian was descended from the ancient Greeks, but they defined a barbarian as anyone who wasn't Greek. Anyone who was not from their city-states was a barbarian.
Yep.
Look at that ethnocentric, egocentric attitude. We still have that. Libertarians have that. Every movement has that. It's part of the psychological reinforcement of the movement. It's something that's helpful, but is to be also guarded against. And it's a permanent human challenge. We're not going to evolve out of it in the next 10,000 years. And by the way, I am not a doomster. I think human beings are going to be here 1,000 years from now, 10,000 years from now, and they are going to be the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and we're going to have deaths because of that, but we can survive that and bounce back. The Earth is still going to be here, and we're still going to be here in 5,000, 10,000 years. Okay. We're not going to be here forever. 99% of all the species in history have been already gone extinct, and if we have a major asteroid that hits the Earth again that we can't deflect in advance, we could go bye-bye. But there's no indication of that happening in the next century. And all these young people who aren't having children and are despairing and committing suicide because they've been taught by a culture that everything's hopeless and that somehow climate change, which is certainly real, is so bad that we're all going to go into disaster. This kind of doomsday thinking is causing a lot of depression among our young people, and they're not choosing to grow up and have kids, which is one of the major problems of the rest of this century. Well, I mean, I could go on.
We've mentioned several novelists who have died. Is Ayn Rand inspiring another generation of novelists? I'm really concerned about this, and maybe it's Ayn Rand's image has changed, and new novelists just aren't being inspired. Or what's going on here? Do you think she's still? What do you think about this?
I was just having a email thread conversation when we notified Lionel Shriver that she was nominated for Mania, and she mentioned Ayn Rand. She was familiar with Ayn Rand. She didn't say she agreed with Ayn Rand, but I think there's a lot of people who are familiar with her. I don't know if they're directly inspired by her. I know some people like Robert Beninato, who is an objectivist, who wrote some books, including some crime thriller detective novels that from that framework. I think that what actually happens with writers is that they fall in love with different writers as they grow up, and they might be inspired by not just one writer, but by a whole constellation of them. Oh, I'd like to write a novel like that. You could be inspired by Victor Hugo to write an epic thing like Les Miserables. I don't think there's anyone who's the next Ayn Rand. But is there anyone who's the next Robert Heinlein either? Is there anyone who's the next anyone? We can make comparisons. But people, if they're good writers, are going to develop their own identity, and we should celebrate that.
We've talked about novels. What are some things in other media, like movies, that you think libertarians should listen to? And
well, connecting with the Prometheus Awards, we have recognized one or two films with a special Prometheus Award. One is Serenity, which has a lot of individualism and libertarianism in it. The band of this team on this starship are trying to fight a centralizing authoritarian system and discover that they did a drug therapy on a distant frontier planet that backfired and caused the ravers. And it shows the backfiring of the best intentions of authoritarian people. It's very classic libertarian. Also, V for Vendetta. V for Vendetta is one of only two works in the history of the Prometheus Award that has been recognized 2 times. We have a rule prohibiting any specific work of fiction from being recognized a second time with the Prometheus Award. However, V for Vendetta was first recognized as a graphic novel. And then the film was separately recognized with a special award. The only other example is L. Neil Smith's The Probability Broach, which is a zestful, rambunctious, alternate reality adventure SF novel that contrasts sort of a Hamiltonian world with a Jeffersonian anarchist world that has a lot of humor in it. Years later, a couple of decades later, L. Neil Smith collaborated with the cartoonist Scott Beezer, who I knew growing up in Texas. He and I were both active in the libertarian movement in the 70s. He's a great cartoonist. They did the graphic novel of The Probability Brooch, which also won a special award. But V for Vendetta is a very powerful film. Serenity is a very powerful film. And then on top of that, for the first time in history, a libertarian science fiction film won the Academy Award for Best Picture 2 years ago. Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. I did a blog entry about that. We didn't give it an award. But interestingly, if you look at the film, it's really, in many ways, about individual choice and about a besieged family going through alternate realities, struggling for self-determination. And also, you know, the Academy Awards, which I used to cover for years as a film critic, they didn't even have a nomination for actor or actress in the category of science fiction or horror until the 1970s, when Sissy Spacek was nominated for Best Actress for Carrie, and then Sigourney Weaver was nominated for Alien. But the first film to win the Academy Award for Best Picture in the category of speculative fiction was Lord of the Rings, which is a fantasy. And then 2 years ago, Everything Everywhere All at Once, it's a multiverse SF story. That won Best Picture. That's the first time a science fiction film won the Academy Award, and it happens to be very libertarian. I have a blog about it 2 years ago that you could look up in the search engine, type in the name, and you'll see the blog in which I analyze how it fits both science fiction and has libertarian themes. And I think very few libertarians were aware of that or celebrated it. Reason Magazine maybe did so. But I think that sometimes there's this besieged minority attitude that any movement develops, and then they underestimate how there are mainstream cultural events that are very compatible with or reflective of some of your values.
Yes. You know, Serenity, of course, was a film made based on the Firefly TV series, which was, of course, made by Joss Whedon. And I think Joss definitely had plans for that series that he didn't get to flush out. It was kind of sad that
it was sad.
Sad because it was the classic example of a just network mismanagement of a TV show, showing the episodes out of order, putting it up against the world, occasionally preempted for the World Series and all that stuff. But also it's speaking about film, what do you think about the Saturn Awards?
I don't follow them very closely, but obviously they focus on a lot of great science fiction films and stuff. The Hugo Awards have a category for long form best dramatic thing where it can be a film, and they also have a short form for drama for the Hugos every year that can be a TV episode. And there's some really good stuff that's been nominated there. I mean, This is a rich era for science fiction and fantasy, but there's also a lot of mediocre stuff. I mean, I saw they did a remake of Fahrenheit 451 as a series. I didn't think it measured up to the original. Yeah. They did a redo of The Prisoner, and it didn't measure up to the original. But, it's nice that they're trying, and there's so much out there.
Well, is the book always better than the movie?
Well, besides yearning to see a film version of the last great Ira Levin novel that hasn't been made into a movie, This Perfect Day, what is the greatest first choice of a great libertarian SF novel that most libertarians or other people would say, or the greatest Robert Heinlein? It's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. They've made movies of several of his other novels. And, there was that director who wanted to give a fascist tinge to Starship Troopers with that film version and its inferior sequels. But why haven't they made a film of The Moon is a Harsh Mistress? It's one of the classics. They even started doing a series, which I saw the first season of on one of the streaming channels, of Asimov's Foundation trilogy. Everything is now technically done well, and yet it doesn't have the impact it would have had 10 or 20 years ago because there's so much out there. Yeah. And for some reason it didn't quite work. Those prequels to The Lord of the Rings on Amazon, or the prequel to Game of Thrones. They're some of them. They're just milking these formulas to death, and it's not as good as the original.
Yeah, they are. Also, not science fiction. I think one of the great libertarian movies is Dallas Buyers Club.
It certainly shows that this guy is desperate to save himself and get the right drugs for AIDS, and he can't get it through the bureaucracy, so he goes on the black market and finds it and gets it himself through a private free market capitalist network.
Yep.
And I can see what you're talking about there. I enjoyed that film. Matthew McConaughey certainly deserved his Academy Award for Best Actor for that role. There are a lot of themes in a lot of films that resonate.
Yeah.
In terms of favorites, let me mention, I have a top 10 list of the Prometheus Hall of Fame winners for Best Classic Fiction that I think anyone should read to really get a sense of the literature. I think if you read most of these, you'd get a really good understanding of the literature and also of the ideas. I mentioned Heinlein's The Moon's Harsh Mistress. We've mentioned Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. We've mentioned Robert Anton Wilson and Bob Shea's Illuminatus trilogy. Those are on my list, along with George Orwell's 1984 and his Animal Farm, which was inducted some years later into the Prometheus Hall of Fame. I mentioned Kurt Vonnegut's cautionary story, Harrison Bergeron, which was inducted in 2019 into the Hall of Fame. Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. I haven't mentioned F. Paul Wilson. He's one of the most nominated Prometheus winners. He won the very first Prometheus Award in 1979 for Wheels Within Wheels, part of his Lanag trilogy, which also has the novel Healer in it. But it culminates with the novel An Enemy of the State that won the Prometheus Hall of Fame in 1991. What a great title, An Enemy of the State. And it really is the capstone to that future interstellar society where they have functioning free societies, but some threats from authoritarian elements. And I'd recommend that. Also, I was very happy when Hans Christian Andersen's fable, The Emperor's New Clothes, was inducted into the Prometheus Hall of Fame in 2000. There's an example of something embedded in our popular culture that has deep anti-authoritarian and libertarian themes in it that people just take for granted because it's part of the general culture. And then the last one is Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings trilogy. Those are like the classics from a libertarian perspective. And of those people, I would say only 3 of those writers that I know of were actual self-identified libertarians in some ways. Ayn Rand said she wasn't a libertarian, but her politics is libertarian. She didn't like the libertarian movement for various reasons. Heinlein, Rand, and F. Paul Wilson were in some ways libertarian, but all the rest of them were not. But they still wrote some of the seminal works in literature that I think are some of the most enduring works of speculative fiction. And they're all really worth reading.
I just realized I haven't asked you about C.S. Lewis.
Well, I've been pushing to get C.S. Lewis to win a Prometheus Award for 30 years now. Jane Neal Schulman loved both Ayn Rand and C.S. Lewis. Jane Neal Schulman, who I'd known for many decades, I wrote the afterword to his Prometheus winning novel, paperback of The Rainbow Cadenza, an essay that I later republished on the Prometheus blog. Neal was influenced greatly by both Rand and C.S. Lewis, and we both agree. And I'm Jewish, and I've gone through atheism and humanism, and then I began meditating with TM and something else so I can feel the chakras. So I know there's stuff we don't know in the 21st century. I know there's some deeper reality that we don't know. But C.S. Lewis was the greatest Christian artist of the 20th century. And I think he has more than 150 million copies in print, most of which are the 7-volume Chronicles of Narnia, which I read when I was 20. I wish I'd read it when I was 10 or 12, but it's good. Aslan is obviously a metaphor for Christ, and I'm Jewish, but I still love the series. I read his complete works, fiction and nonfiction. And he wrote a science fiction trilogy. One novel set on Venus, one on Mars, and the third one culminating on Earth. Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandria, and the third one is That Hideous Strength. And that I have nominated for the Prometheus Hall of Fame, and it's been a finalist several times, but hasn't won. Well, I could say, yes, C.S. Lewis was not a great science fiction writer, and it's not one of the best novels of that era, but it clearly has an appreciation written in the 1930s or 1940s for the statist collectivist dangers with the new pseudoscience of scientism and bureaucracy. Oh, let's set up the scientists as political bureaucrats, as the philosopher kings of Plato. And he was well aware of the dangers of that to liberty, including freedom of thought, freedom of religion. And I just would like to claim C.S. Lewis as one of ours by having him win the Prometheus Award. And I think that is a classic. Sometimes I've nominated it with the whole trilogy, and sometimes I've just nominated that novel. It's the one thing that fits our award. Maybe it's not as enduring or as popular, as well written as the Chronicles of Narnia, but it really has ideas that are very congruent with libertarianism in there. I would like the world to know that we can claim him as having some of his views
certainly
overlapping with ours. I'm glad you asked about C.S. Lewis. I should mention there's a few other leading major science fiction writers who've never won the Prometheus Award, who I've met, talked with. Gregory Benford and Robert Silverberg. They're both avowed libertarians, but Gregory Benford usually writes hard SF that doesn't include political themes. And so he was a contributing editor to Reason Magazine, and he was a professor of physics, USCD, at Southern San Diego. He's had a stroke recently, so he's recovering from that. But he's written some great novels, but none of them happen to fit the Prometheus Award. So it's just a limitation. We can't recognize him. Robert Silverberg won the Nebula Award in the early 70s for A Time of Changes, which has exactly the same theme as Rand's Anthem, a rediscovery of the self. And I wanted it to win the Prometheus Hall of Fame. I've nominated several times. It's been a finalist several times. But other people in our diverse organization say, it's in the hippie, let's have psychedelic drugs and discover ourselves through that, and they just don't like it culturally. So that's the one novel he wrote that most reflects his libertarian views, but he's a great writer who I've read many of his other novels. And so we've sometimes had blogs acknowledging them. But what that shows you is tip of the iceberg stuff. Buried underneath the surface, there are people who are some great writers who maybe have individualism or libertarian values in their personal view, but they're restless creative writers who just are motivated to write about different things that maybe have nothing to do with that. And it would be inappropriate for them to just throw in some, this is John Galt speaking speech of ideology. It would undermine the novel. People should be free to write what they want to write.
Yeah, I did want to get back to movies. While it's not explicitly libertarian, I think one of the most prescient movies ever made is Network.
Tell me why.
It predicts reality TV. It predicts the pursuit of ratings. It's also a very funny movie. It just seems to get all of that stuff right. And when you consider that it was made in 1976, I think that just makes you realize how brilliant that movie was.
I would give first credit to the writer, Paddy Chayefsky,
yes,
who is one of the greatest television and film screenwriters of the 50s and 60s. One of my favorite films from the early 50s is Executive Suite with William Holden, Barbara Stanwyck, June Allison. I've seen it several times, most recently this past year. It's a realistic look inside the boardroom of a big company with different kinds of human battles. And it has real integrity and courage in it.
Yeah.
I think he also wrote a novel called Altered States, which basically updates Robert Louis Stevenson's novella, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, updated it to the psychedelic future very brilliantly. And I love the novel. It was then became a movie with Blair Brown and William Hurt in 1979 that I liked a lot. It sort of faded from public consciousness. But Chayefsky was a great screenwriter, and it was his vision that they put on screen. Now, I think, was it Sidney Lumet who was the director of that?
I believe so. You know, another thing about Chayefsky, though, is you know that speech that James Garner gives in the Americanization of Emily about that's a great anti-war speech.
One of my libertarian friends.
Chayefsky wrote that too. Yeah.
Well, that's amazing. One of my closest friends, Steve Fagerquist, who recently retired after 40 years in Hollywood as a digital effects artist, who has a credit, if you look him up on that movie database, of about 60 films he did special effects on, including the Tron sequel and several Star Treks. He ranks the Americanization of Emily way up there among the greatest films ever made. He and I happen to agree. We each have a favorite film, which is the same. I love Hitchcock, and so does he. But my favorite all-time film is Hitchcock's North by Northwest. And it's just like the perfect Hitchcock film. The screenwriter is Ernest Lemon, who later wrote the screenplays for West Side Story, adapted, and The Sound of Music. And he was trying to do the definitive Hitchcock film that give you everything that the great Hitchcock films gives you, which is not just suspense. Yes, he was the master of suspense, but also romance and also comedy, plus the greatest set pieces in the history of Hitchcock films, like the scene in the cornfield and ending up on Mount Rushmore. And that film is not science fiction. And I wouldn't even say it's a film necessarily about individualism, but it's just a great movie. And
it's often been said that Cary Grant was the only actor that Hitchcock liked. And he did quite a few. And I think he did 4 movies with Hitchcock.
He did, but he also did 4 movies with James Stewart, and he would have wanted to do more with Grace Kelly, but she went off and became a royal princess. So,
yeah, it's really, I'm trying to think of some other, I think we'd probably want to talk about Star Trek and the Star Wars. When I think about, you talked about authority, and I think about great leadership. I don't think anybody exemplifies great leadership more than Captain James T. Kirk.
I think he was actually the most immature of all the Star Trek captains. I've seen all of that. Okay. I prefer I like Jean-Luc Picard better. I thought he was more of a mature soul.
Okay.
William Shatner, great guy. He was a little immature when he was making the movie, but he's incarnating a character who's very much a young soul. Plus, people have pointed out that the first series, it's like you're externalizing conflict by taking the mind and the heart and the will of one person and separating out into 3 characters, where Spock is the mind, and Bones is the heart, and Kirk is the will. And that's a nice schematic that allows you to externalize the conflict, which you have to do for a TV or movie show, so it's not interior monologue. But I enjoy Star Trek. I grew up with it. I wouldn't say I was a Trekkie. I actually love Galaxy Quest, which David Mamet, I've been reading his book, says is actually one of the best screenplays of the modern era. Just brilliantly perfect screenplay. And that's an appreciation of the Trekkie spirit in a very clever film. But, in Star Trek, they imagine there's no money and that there's no economy. This is a utopian fallacy. It's amazing, despite this radically ridiculous utopian thing, they still can have stories that are interesting. They do show in later episodes the Ferengi as money-grubbing capitalists who are also liars. which starts to shade almost into The Merchant of Venice and anti-Semitic tropes, except in real life, I think I saw an article saying that the average person in the Western and Japan and Hong Kong, South Korea countries today has the average wealth is about, I don't know, 1,600 times more in terms of availability of using horsepower than just a couple of centuries ago. And almost nobody knows it. And you should read Steven Pinker's books, in particular, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Science, Reason, Humanism, and Progress. That's just empirically, chapter by chapter, shows how much progress there's been in every single area of longevity and health and wealth and reducing environmental problems, reducing accidents in work-related injuries, decreasing crime, and how people think it's the worst time ever because they have no sense of history and no comparison of how much worse it was before. Well, no matter how wealthy people get, what is the real foundation of economics? It's time, not money. It's our limited life measured in time. And and that's valuable to you. So to cooperate with other people, you need to find a shorthand way, if you're helping somebody, to get some resources in exchange for your valuable time. And that's why some version of money will always exist, and some version of the economy will always exist. And I'm sure some economists could explain it in a lot more depth than I can. But, Star Trek has this Gene Roddenberry vision that is defective, and yet it's still an interesting scenario because it has a lot of courage in it. Meanwhile, Star Wars, I would never live in Star Wars or the Jetsons because they don't have any fences, and it's way up high, and you take one step off, and your dog and your baby dies. Yeah. Are there no lawsuits in the Jetsons or in Star Wars? Because, that wouldn't happen for like one instant. It all is this visionary liberation from gravity, liberation from all constraints idea. I loved the Jetsons when I was growing up. But, why do we have no flying cars? Well, what happens if you run out of gas now? You might be an inconvenience. What happens if you run out of gas in the air? Can I use profanity on your program? You fucking die. So let's see. Risks, costs, benefits. Yeah. We're not going to have flying cars. It's possible there are flying cars now. They're like a hybrid that can't be successful, partly because of all the government regulations for both in the air and on the ground. And you have to have a compromise between them to have it. I think they cost $350,000, but they're never going to be mass produced like the Jetsons' vision. Why would you want to be up there like that when any moment of the day, if you're daydreaming, you will die? We have to have triple redundancy in engineering, a backup to a backup, because the fact of humanity is we're all at different stages of struggling to master things, ascending to that, and then in our old age declining, and we're all fallible. We all make mistakes. Something is super poorly designed if it requires people to think rationally and focus on the attention 100% of the time, or they have a serious injury or death.
Yeah, that's true. I don't. That is interesting. I never thought about that with the Jetsons. Of course, yeah.
I mean, I love the artistic vision. And
sometimes I think Serenity. One show that I got into that was not that popular, and it seems to have been forgotten. I don't know if you ever watched Roswell back in 1999.
I watched a little bit of it. I didn't get hooked on it. I've just seen a couple episodes. This is part of the richness of so many things in our modern era are now science fiction or fantasy. I remember when I was a kid, all we had was The Twilight Zone and Outer Limits. And then we had Lost in Space, which was, pathetic on some levels. But that's all we had. And if there was the only thing they had available like that, you watched it. Yeah. It used to be in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when they released a science fiction film, we get to go. I wrote a column for my newspaper remembering one of my favorite moments. Which was May 1977, when I got in line to watch the first Friday matinee of this film called Star Wars, which was not hyped as a big film. I think it was 20th Century Fox that summer was expecting Damnation Alley to be the big science fiction film, which is a dystopian film that I also went to see. Well, there were hundreds of us there, science fiction fans, through word of mouth. We heard it was so rare that there was going to be a science fiction movie, and there was some scuttlebutt that this might be a good movie. And I remember we packed the first showing, and the opening shot, when you saw this amazing spaceship come in over your head, and you're excited, and then it's followed by an even bigger spaceship, and that shot kept on going, there was a roar and applause and a giddy sense of, my God, this is amazing, because we knew this is a shot that normally would be the last shot in any previous science fiction film. If they're putting their first card on the table, and it's this opening shot, how much better is this movie going to be? What is it going to build to from this? They would be insane if they started off with their best scene. They would be all disappointing at that. We knew instinctively this is going to be an amazing film from the very first shot. That's what I wrote about in my personal column years ago.
Yeah,
that's when science fiction was an event. Now it's an everyday part of the wallpaper.
It's become part of, I think what was interesting about Roswell is, you had these hybrid aliens who didn't want to be discovered by the government. They were hiding out. And so it was a constant battle to keep their identity secret and to protect their friends. But it definitely, and also for a while, Roswell had an extremely dedicated fan base. The aliens would put Tabasco sauce on their food. So somebody decided, instead of writing letters to the network, we'll send them bottles of Tabasco sauce. And it got their attention, and then later it looked like the WB would cancel it. So they started sending Tabasco sauce bottles to the UPN. The UPN picked it up for a third season. So you actually had, fans lobbying a network, pick up our show, please. And it worked. But it lost its edge after the first 16 episodes or so.
There probably are a lot of other shows that had that potential and then weren't discovered. Serenity's an example where people didn't fully appreciate it at the time.
Yeah, one thing that I think every once in a while, though, you don't see it on the screen, but somebody behind the scenes leaves, and Roswell seemed to go downhill after a guy named David Nutter left. He was, producer, director. There wasn't any significant.
Those key people can really make a difference. However, there are others where someone else has taken over and they managed to keep it going for some years.
But I think obviously I probably watch too much TV, but I also credit MASH for the reason why I'm such an anti-war person.
That was a very dark comedy. I think that ran for 10 seasons. It had a huge final season. More than 50 million people saw it. A major landmark. I loved it from the Robert Altman film.
Yeah, the film's good. And I must have been 3, and I wish I could remember all the details, but I can swear I can remember watching the Henry Blake episode when it aired. And I would have been either 3 or 4 at the time. I just remember one moment from that. But I have to go back and look. I have some early TV memories, and it's I was talking about Star Trek. I mean, Captain Kirk was the first live action TV character that I knew by name.
Do you have a favorite science fiction film?
I thought Serenity was really good. Another movie, science fiction, that I thought was really good? Super 8.
I saw that.
Yeah.
It was Spielberg-esque going back to the 80s. Yeah. I liked it, but not enough to see it a second time. I sort of think with the Academy Awards, if something is deserving of being Best Picture, its real test of time is, do you ever want to see it again? If I only want to see it, if I see a movie once, maybe I won't like it. Maybe I won't like it as much. But if I don't have a desire to ever see it again, it's not a classic. There are some movies, I don't know how many times I've seen. I mean, It's a Wonderful Life, The Maltese Falcon, Citizen Kane, Casablanca, The Wizard of Oz, Meet Me in St. Louis. I've seen them 20, 30, 40 times.
Yeah.
They're like a ritual of American life. They're just wonderful films where I find new delight in them over and over. And there's some novels I can read over and over again. And it's wonderful when you find that, but you can't expect it.
One thing I liked about Super 8 is anytime I watch a retro movie, I wonder, are they going to screw something up? And they almost, I mean, this was made in 2007 or so, and it was set in 1979. And I'm just thinking to myself, okay, is there going to be a song that wasn't out yet? Are they going to, and they never got, and everything was historically accurate in that movie. I've also heard gun people will notice the same things. Like they'll have a movie that takes place in 1890, but the gun wasn't invented until 1910. Stuff like that. And
little anachronisms.
Yeah, historical. Anytime you do historical fiction, you really take that risk, and somebody's going to catch it. I mean, there's a great episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer called "I Only Have Eyes for You," and that song is one of the themes of the show, and it refers back to something horrible that happened in 1955. And I said, that song didn't come out until 1959.
No, I Only Have Eyes for You was in a Busby Berkeley movie in the early 1930s.
Okay, well, but in that movie they keep singing the most famous version of it, which was 1959. But yeah, I'm not really surprised. It probably has an earlier version though. And I got to say too, I was a big fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I don't know what you thought of Buffy, but
there's so much that you just can't keep up with things.
Oh, yeah.
I saw a few episodes, and they've said up until the streaming bubble finally began popping, we're in the platinum era, the platinum age of television. It's the golden era in the 50s and 60s, and now we're in the platinum era, because first there were like an unprecedented 300 scripted TV series, not counting the reality TV series. And then there was 400. Then there was 500. And maybe 100 of them were really good that would normally be like among the best. But who has time for that?
Who has time for that?
So much stuff. You cannot even keep up.
There's only so much. There's only so much advertising. Something else too, though. And we were talking about earlier about self-publishing. Another guy you might want to check out is a guy named Michael Bunker. And this is something that I don't think ever would have happened in traditional publishing. But believe it or not, he started writing Amish science fiction.
Oh, that's an interesting thing.
And I remember he used to.
Are they imagining an Amish village colonizing a frontier planet? Something as obvious as that.
He's got. I think it's maybe relationship with aliens, but he's not quite as strict on the Amishness as some people are. He will drive a car, and he would drink beer, but he still has the clothes and everything. I just thought that was one of those things that you could get out there that you could never get out through traditional publishing, because who's going to take a risk on something like that? But
that's true.
He got some popularity, and he got things made into a movie. I don't know if we'll ever. It's a shame we haven't seen indie films break out the way books have, but I think they're still trying to go through traditional systems, But I've seen people make good indie films for $5,500.
Well, a lot of the insiders in Hollywood say there's just a constant uncertainty there, because even the experts, nobody really knows what's going to be successful. It's a throw of the dice. You can try to have a reliable source material or a big actor or a franchise. That's why they go to sequels so much and franchises and series, to try to reduce the risk. Yep. But people cannot predict with any degree of certainty what will be successful. There's so many movies that look like they were going to be disasters, like Casablanca. They were rewriting the movie constantly while they were making it, and the people making it, Humphrey Bogart had arguments with the director, Michael Curtiz, didn't like the way they were going. Ingrid Bergman had a problem with it. She thought her big film was going to be with Gary Cooper, For Whom the Bell Tolls, adaptation of Ernest Hemingway, and it turned out that Casablanca was a masterpiece. But the writers came to her early on and said, please play your role with ambiguity, because we haven't figured out yet who she's going to leave with at the end. Is it going to, she's going to stay with Rick? So can you play it both ways? Well, she's a great actress, and she added this level of ambiguity. So you really have that suspense. You really don't know. But nobody expected Casablanca to end up so good. And no one, they didn't expect it to win Best Picture or become a classic. Another example is The Maltese Falcon. George Raft was offered the lead role, and he turned it down, and he regretted it for the rest of his life. But he turned it down for understandable reasons. This was not the first, not the second, but the third time they were going to adapt the same source material. Maybe it was a Raymond Chandler novel, I think. And the other two were just nothings. And John Huston, it was his first time neophyte director. Who was John Huston? Nobody knew. Nobody knew he was going to be one of the greatest directors, who did 3 masterpieces: The Maltese Falcon, Treasure of the Sierra Madre, and The African Queen, not to mention The Man Who Fell to Earth, which is a great adaptation of a great Rudyard Kipling story, which has libertarian themes in it. But he was a first-time director, and he wrote his own adaptation of the screenplay. It was rational for George Raft to turn it down. It didn't look, but then it ended up being one of the great films. Nobody knows. That's the scary thing. You think, oh, there are adults in the room. There are experts who know about this. Maybe in engineering, maybe in a harder area of science. But when it comes to culture, the exciting thing about it is, you can say it's anxiety, but it's excitement. A lot of times, if you feel anxiety, if you go into it a little bit and are with it and feel it, like in a transcendental meditation way, where you're with it and not trying to control it or deny it, you understand that after a while you penetrate this cap of anxiety, and underneath it, it's actually aliveness and excitement. This was an insight I got from Nathaniel Brandon. And there's a lot of excitement about the fact that culture is such a strange alchemy, and there's always new changes and things coming out.
And things can happen. I remember looking it up. I can't remember where it was, but I looked up an obituary for Lionel Barrymore, who died in 1954. And of course, now he's most famous for playing Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life. And that obituary, mentions that he was an actor. But guess what? No mention of It's a Wonderful Life. Yeah, it's amazing. You have no way. A couple of years ago, I was doing an interview for a feature with a guy, I can't remember his name, Elliot Goldenthal, who was composing a new opera based on Moby Dick, Melville's Moby Dick. And the libretto was written by the great playwright Terrence McNally, who I was a huge fan of. I was researching Herman Melville's life. And when I was in college, I read both Taipei, which is a great South Sea yarn, and Moby Dick. Reading Melville's life was so disturbing. First of all, in the year 1900, American society had advanced to the point where the average lifespan had risen to 47, and he lived like into his 60s. In his life, he had so much tragedy. He had so many people die on him, a wife, a sister, a mother, from horrible illness. He had initial success with Taipei and Moby Dick. It wasn't like it's a rave classic, and then it faded. And then his later stuff people ignored, and he was basically forgotten. And when he died, he thought he was forgotten. It wasn't until a generation later, around 1914, 1917, around World War I, when not one, not two, but 3 different American professors at Northeast universities, partly motivated by nationalism, decided that there's an American canon of literature. Before that, people had sort of an inferiority complex in America. And they looked at the stuff and they said, well, Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter and Melville's Moby Dick, were our great American classics, and it was renewed. But Melville lived his life and thought he would not be remembered. And at the time when they came out, there was some popularity, and then they completely faded. And you think about what other people have faded that are left to be rediscovered.
What do you suppose motivates these college literature experts to decide,
well, this is a great novel, this is a bad novel? I mean, that was one thing that somewhat attracted me to Rand, was I figured, well, if all the literature experts hate her this much, she must be pretty good.
That's not a good rule of thumb. Sometimes that is not a good thing to rely on at all. And the opposite of that, it can't be relied on either. There is some sense of people collaborating and people deferring to the elite opinion. A lot of theater critics look at how the New York Times look at it, and they are afraid of sticking themselves out and disagreeing. I was a little bit more adventurous and sometimes saying, well, I think they're overpraising this or they're underpraising that. And I would say so in my reviews, but a lot of people are afraid of doing that. They want to play it safe and have the conventional view. Some people are corrupted by ideology, which I'm not. You might think I was with the Prometheus Award, but I'm not. There's some bad libertarian science fiction that's been written. There's a lot of mediocre stuff. Theodore Sturgeon, the great short story science fiction writer, had his Sturgeon's Law. 90% of everything is mediocre. Only I think he used the word 90% of everything is crap. It's the rule of mediocrity. It's Pareto's law. It's the norm. And just because something's popular doesn't mean it's good, and it doesn't mean it's bad. There's the reverse snobbery of people thinking, well, if it's that popular, we have to look down on it. No. There are some things that are just really good.
Yeah. But I had Jack Mason on once, and he said, they don't like Rand because she's politically incorrect, and that's the whole problem. He said the same thing about Margaret Mitchell.
There was a recent poll of millions of Americans to come up with the 100 most beloved fiction novels, and they had a rule that whatever got the most votes would be listed. If, like, Mark Twain got a lot of votes for both Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, they would list him only. Every author can only have one novel on the list, so whatever got the highest votes would be on there. So for Mark Twain, it was Tom Sawyer, which everybody reads in 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, rather than Huckleberry Finn. Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged was on there, or it might have been The Fountainhead. Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, which I read in the 70s, is a good romantic novel. That's on there. To Kill a Mockingbird is on there. I did a blog about that for the Prometheus blog some years ago. It's interesting. Some of the Prometheus winners are on that list. And it's very much a popular thing. It's novels that people have read and loved, and they stick with them. But how many novels or stories or TV shows do you watch, and then they just go out of your head and you never have any desire to see them again? Most. It's really, 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 really hard to excel. And that's why I like to recognize when somebody really does have great individual merit. But everybody has a personal reaction to it. That personal reaction doesn't mean that it's subjective. It could be a real objective reaction, but it's still very personal emotionally. My favorite example, one of my 3 favorite musicals, my favorite when I was growing up was West Side Story. I still love it. And the 2 musicals that I most loved growing up and seeing on Broadway were Sweeney Todd and Les Miserables. I also like Ragtime and Spring Awakening. And some of my friends said, in all of the musicals that you love, people are dying and there were tragedies. I said, no, I'm not negative. I think they have terrific scores and they have intense, emotionally powerful drama about life and death issues. And that's why I love them. But first of all, with the score. Well, Les Miserables became an unexpected success, and I think was translated into like 26 languages and was done all over the world and in all these different languages at the same moments in different cultures in South America, in Iceland, in Japan, in Hong Kong, in Johannesburg. People laughed, or people cried, or people gasped, or people sat in rapt silence in exactly the same moments. And they had a tagline, the world's most popular musical, which was well-deserved. It was not hype.
Yeah.
And yet, when it opened in 1985 in London's West End, there were about 10 or 12 national newspapers there. Most of them gave it mixed reviews. They called it overly melodramatic. Some critics dubbed it the glums. One critic, Sheridan Morley, wrote a prescient review, which I loved, saying that this is a musical for the ages. This has a universal power, and it's going to appeal to people. And he was right, but he was the maverick exception to the initial critical reaction. And one of my favorite stories, the producer was Cameron McIntosh. And this was initially a collaboration between him as a private commercial producer and the Royal Shakespeare Company. And they had a limited subscription audience, I think, for 3 weeks. He saw the opening night reviews the next morning up in his office with a coworker, a co-producer. And based on the reviews, they were going to pull the plug on the show, meaning that after its initially planned 3-week run at the Royal Shakespeare Company, their hopes to transfer it to the London West End for a commercial run, they were going to pull the plug. And while they were making this decision, because he really believed in it, he was the one who discovered the record that Claude Michel Schoenberg and Elaine Boublil had done from their early 80s musical that nobody else had heard of. I was so thrilled to interview them for a feature in the 1990s. They got an emergency call from the box office. And the box office said, "You got to come down here now." And what? "You just got to come down here." And they came down there expecting, oh my God, is there people demanding their money back? And they were shocked. There was a line outside the box office. And what's the problem? Everybody's demanding tickets. And we've never experienced this in our lifetime. And they went outside and the line seemed to go on forever.
Yeah.
And they go down to the end of the block and the line kept going. Word of mouth. People saying to other people, "I saw this show. It's the most amazing show I've ever seen. You've got to get tickets." Word of mouth is spreading like wildfire. And it was going against the critical elite who were being a little condescending and sniffy about it. And it triumphed and became one of the most enduring musicals of the modern era. That shows you that even the experts don't really know for sure. And everybody has their biases.
Yeah. I'm going to have to go pretty soon. How did they adopt, how did they take that big fat book by Hugo and make it into a musical?
Well, I think it's a 1,400-page novel, which I've read more than once. And the original musical had a first act of 1 hour and 45 minutes.
Yeah.
And altogether it was 3 hours and 15 minutes. Now, on its 10th anniversary on Broadway, because there's an extra surcharge, union charge on Broadway, which is very restrictive, they decided to enhance its run. They trimmed it with an extra chorus here and there, and they took out 15 minutes so it would end after 3 hours, and then it would not trigger overtime, and that extended its life for another 12 years. I think it set a record at the time, which has since been exceeded by Phantom of the Opera, which recently closed a year ago after 35 years. But it ran for 22 years on Broadway. And on top of that, after it closed, just 2 or 3 years later, they brought it back for a revival that ran for 2 years. That was so popular.
That's interesting. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention that we haven't mentioned?
Well, I want to mention some of the lesser known Prometheus winners that I think are underestimated that are among my personal favorites. I've already mentioned Ira Levin's This Perfect Day and Terry Pratchett's Night Watch and Sarah Hoyt's Dark Ship Thieves. But I want to mention another great dystopian novel that has strong classical liberal themes, and that's Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange, which is somewhat different from the Stanley Kubrick film. It has much stronger classical liberal, neo-libertarian values in it. I think that's a great Hall of Fame winner. And also Donald Kingsbury's novel, Psychohistorical Crisis, won Best Novel in 2002. It's a very rare novel that, if you've read Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy, where his technocratic idea of central planning is, we have these people who are scientists and they can predict the future and they're trying to save civilization. His whole novel imagines a world like that, not the same world as Asimov, and critiques it from a Hayekian perspective about the impossibility of central planning and how no few individuals has enough concentrated knowledge to really control a diverse society and economy and civilization. And it was a really powerfully insightful novel with a subtle theme that's a key libertarian theme that is rarely ever dramatized. And so I highly recommend Donald Kingsbury's Psychohistorical Crisis.
And of course, Kubrick immediately makes me think of Dr. Strangelove. So
a great dark comedy Yeah.
Great dark comedy, anti-nuclear, and of course, I really, I often say greatest actor of all time, and I'm not kidding. Peter Sellers, he was phenomenal. He's phenomenal in everything he does.
One of the great mistakes in the history of the Academy Awards is when he was nominated for Being There, which is such an amazing movie and such an incredibly subtle performance. He was nominated for Best Actor, but he didn't win. He should have won. He should have won an Academy Award. He was such an amazing chameleon. Yeah. Well, Chris, it's been great talking to you. I really appreciated the chance to talk. We went on to a lot of other subjects I didn't think we were going to talk about.
So is it just lfs.org where the Libertarian Futurist Society is?
It's www.lfs.org, standing for Libertarian Futurist Society. And on that page, on the top, you can click on the blog or the Prometheus Awards list showing all the winners and clicking on appreciation next to it to read why it won and how it fits the far more sophisticated and subtle and far-reaching libertarian viewpoint than most people ever imagine.
Yeah, and do you have your own personal site out there? Or?
No. I'm one of the editors of the Prometheus blog and write for that and stuff. So
yeah, and
thanks again for inviting me on your show.
Yeah, and yeah, it was good having you. This was a great long talk. We got to talk about a lot of things.
Cool.
Please get my novel Escape from the Village, which is a middle grade sci-fi dystopian novel. Check out my Substack. Go like the video, subscribe to the channel. And I'm Chris Baker. This is Fountainhead Forum 185. We're out.